Good afternoon. My name is Ron Green and I'm the Trade Commissioner here in Seoul, and it is my pleasure to be able to provide the opening remarks for today's Australian Superannuation Fund Management and Return Policy and Default Option webinar, which we are holding in partnership with the Korea Financial Investment Association, or KOFIA. But first some housekeeping comments. First of all, today's seminar will be in English only. This has proven to be perhaps the most effective in time limitations that we have. Presentations will be distributed later in PDF form. There will also be an opportunity for Q&A, and you can provide your questions on the chat function, which we will try to respond to. But any questions from the people in the room today will be prioritised, but we will get back to you with your questions. There's also been a slight change to the program. We did have Nick Sherry speaking directly after my comments, but just for some logistics reasons, we've changed the order, and Mr. Zach May, Executive Director of IFM, will be speaking. So as I mentioned, we're in the room here today with KOFIA, and I would like to acknowledge the strong support that KOFIA has provided in getting ready for today. KOFIA represents the interests of the financial companies in Korea who are their members, and we are fortunate to have Senior Manager Teresa Rue with us today. We're also joined online by Samsung Securities, NH Securities, Mirai Assets, and other Korean investment companies online. And today we also had IFM and Auscham in the room today with us. We are very grateful to our guest speakers, Zach May, Eva Shearling, and Nick Sherry, who I'll introduce in a moment. This year marks the 60th anniversary of diplomatic relations between our two countries. It is also a milestone towards recognising the depth and strength of the economic and strategic relationship between Australia and the Republic of Korea. On this milestone, we are confirming our desire to generate greater public awareness of Australia and the Republic of Korea's shared values, particularly in greater socio-cultural cooperation, of which today's webinar is a good example of. By way of a segue in today's session, it is worth noting that Australia's financial service industry is one of the largest contributors to the stability and growth of the Australian economy and one of our highest growth sectors. Australia's superannuation system is consistently acclaimed as one of the best models of retirement income provision in the world, achieving investment returns comparable with other benchmark models around the world. The Australian system is underpinned by mandatory workplace retirement savings schemes called Superannuation, which has produced the fourth largest pension pool in the world, valued at over $2.3 trillion US in 2021. Assets under management in 2019 to 2020 is 2.7 trillion, with an average 5-year growth rate of 5.2%. Through to 2024-25, assets are expected to grow to 3.6 trillion, which is a growth rate of 5.6%. KOFIA has been lobbying to have a retirement pension default option bill passed by the Korean National Assembly, and this bill may even become law this year. The default option will improve the return for Korean retirement fund investments and also open up opportunities for increased Korean investor activity in the Australian market. KOFIA has also visited Australia to benchmark our superannuation system, and there has been considerable sharing of information, knowledge and experience between our two financial markets and our respective superannuation and pension scheme experts. Today is another example of this. I would now like to ask today's co-host, KOFIA's Teresa Rue, Senior Manager, International Research Division, to say a few words. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, Ron. My name is Teresa Rue, and I am from the Korea Financial Investment Association, KOFIA, at the International Affairs and Research Division. It is a great pleasure to hold this webinar with the Australian Embassy, Austrade, and it is an honor to be able to hear from the people who are and who were actually responsible in setting up and running the superannuation system in Australia. Today, Korea is also facing issues that are linked to the retirement pension and its financial products. So KOFIA is truly grateful to be able to hold this webinar with the Austrade. We truly hope that this webinar will give insight to the people who are currently responsible for the work in the Korean retirement pension. 오늘 오신 분들이 한국 분들이 많으셔서 제가 간단하게 국문으로도 인사 말씀을 좀 드리도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 개최하는 금융투자협회 글로벌 투자 동향 제14차 웨비나에서는 최근 더욱더 중요해지고 있는 퇴직연금과 관련하여 호주의 퇴직연금인 슈퍼애뉴에이션과 디폴트옵션에 대한 내용으로 준비하였습니다. 근본 웨비나는 주한호주대사관 무역대표부 오스트레일드와 공동으로 호주의 퇴직연금 전문가들을 초청하여 심도 깊게 호주의 사례를 살펴보고자 합니다. 특히 호주 슈퍼애니에이션 도입 시 초기 담당 장관이셨던 Zachary 전 호주 연방 상원 의원님께서 직접 슈퍼애니에이션 도입 관련 내용 등에 대해 발표해 주실 예정이며, 또한 Eva Sherling 호주 퇴직연금 수탁자 협회 CEO와 Zachary IFM 호주 자산운용사 이사님께서는 슈퍼애니에이션과 디폴트 옵션의 운영 전략 등에 대해서 발표해 주실 예정입니다. 혹시 웨비나 진행 시 질문이 있으시다면 챗박스에 써서 보내주시기 바라며, 마지막에 Q&A 세션에서 몇 개의 질문을 답해드리도록 하겠습니다. 혹시라도 답변을 못 드린 질문에 대해서는 이메일로 답변을 드리도록 하겠사오니 질문을 보낼 시 답변을 보내드릴 이메일 주소도 같이 적어서 보내주시면 감사하겠습니다. 그럼 이제 오늘 웨비나 진행을 해주실 호주 무역대표부 로널드 그레인 참사관님께서 진행을 해주시겠습니다. Thank you, Ron. Now I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Teresa. So now we move to our first speaker, Mr. Zachary May, Executive Director of IFM Investors. Zach used to work as an executive staff and counsel to the Commissioner, US Securities and Exchange Commission, Washington, D.C., and then moved to the Director of Policy Industry Super Australia in Melbourne. He is now Executive Director, Strategy and Policy, IFM Investors in Melbourne. IFM, as you may know, invests on behalf of like-minded institutions globally, including superannuation, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurers, endowment, foundation and universities. It is also a pleasure to have Kelly Jeong Lee in the room with us today from IFM. So that, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ron, and thank you, Teresa. And I also just want to extend my thanks to the Australian Trade and Investment Commission and the Korean Financial Investment Association for bringing us together today. I'm going to walk through a few slides, but to begin, I just want to set out the 4 points that I want to make today before going through them. And the first one is, as Ron mentioned, the Australian superannuation system has overall performed very well over its history. The second point I want to make today is that there are actually 3 different kinds or categories of funds that exist within the Australian superannuation system, and they perform differently, and they have different priorities and objectives. And thinking about how the policy architecture that enables these different types of funds to exist is relevant in thinking about the future of the Australian system and others. The third point I want to make today is that the best performing part of Australia's system and the best performing retirement systems globally, such as the large defined benefit plans in Canada, the Netherlands, and Denmark, they have common features about trustees that are run only to benefit their members, that the boards of these institutions tend to have representatives that are appointed by employers and employees or unions. The members or the beneficiaries of the fund join the fund by default based on their workplace, and that the pension investment is an employment entitlement rather than something that's sold to them as a financial product. And then the last piece is that the product that they enter is diversified with a focus on long-term growth, meaningful exposure to unlisted assets such as infrastructure and property. And then lastly, the superannuation system in Australia is a creature of public policy and the industrial parties that drove its creation. And the nature of the policy settings that we have today affect how the funds are structured and how they behave. Perhaps what I'll say as we're getting the technology sorted is that the Australian system originated back in the 1980s, really, well, even before then, but it really got going in the 1980s in the course of negotiation between the industrial parties about putting an element of wages into set aside for retirement. And then the question became, well, where do you put these savings? And the initiative to create the superannuation system was done on an industry by industry basis of negotiation. And so we can see the timeline of the Australian superannuation system begins in the 70s and 80s, and then in the 1990s, employer contributions on behalf of employees became a universal, largely universal, and a mandatory entitlement, as Ron mentioned at the beginning. But since that time, the system has experienced tremendous growth, and that growth has been driven by two things. The first one is the contributions and savings being put into the system, and importantly, the net investment returns, with those returns delivering the majority of that growth over time. And as you can see, as the forecasted growth of the system moves into the future, due to the compounding effect of long-term investment returns, this forecast is suggesting that you'd have a continued and faster increase in the size of the system relative to broader economic growth, getting to around 4 trillion Australian dollars in the middle of the, in the next several years. So as we discussed on that last slide, the growth is driven in part by contributions of a percentage of salary, but also in part by net investment returns. And this slide and table shows that international private pension systems do have different rates of return after adjusting for country level inflation. And Australia's performance looks pretty good over the medium and longer term. And it shows similar performance to Canada, Netherlands, and Denmark. And as I mentioned at the top, that's a logical thing to expect, because there is some similarity amongst parts of those systems. Specifically those characteristics of the trustees, whereby they operate on a not-for-profit basis, and members join those funds through default workplace arrangements. If we dig into the Australian system and that overarching performance number, we can break apart that system into actually 3 different categories of funds that serve different kinds of needs and have different kinds of outcomes. And they exist alongside one another in Australia. So it's not a monolithic system, it's actually a diverse system. In the first category of a fund is what some of us would call the not-for-profit segment. And within that segment, you have funds that are industry funds, which invest the savings of workers in industries or now across industries. Corporate funds, which invest the savings of workers in a particular large company. And public sector funds, which historically invest the savings of employees of the public sector, such as state governments. And in this category, you have professional trustees, which have been established by the industrial parties or by the state or municipal governments. They are overseen by directors of these trustees who represent employers or employees. They set investment strategies, and then they engage with asset managers from around the world that might be COFIA members, they might be from Wall Street, they might be a funds manager like IFM. And these trustees engage these sophisticated investment professionals and firms from around the world. And what this system is designed to do is to effectively enable ordinary working people to have professional experts working on their behalf. The second category is the retail sector, where the trustees are established by financial institutions as a business proposition. The directors are appointed by the financial institution, and then they create a large number of products that are then sold to individuals, often through financial planners, with an emphasis on customization and tailoring. And then the last segment is the self-managed segment, where individuals appoint themselves as the trustees, often members of a family, and then they invest in different kinds of products, typically sold through financial planners. As I mentioned, these segments have operated alongside each other for a long time, and we can take a look at how they have performed, recognizing that they often would be said to serve different kinds of purposes. So this slide talks about the performance of the different segments of the Australian system, and while you have over the 10 years, significant performance of each of them relative to a term deposit or CPI, there are differences, and they do tend to flow from those structural characteristics. As you can see, over the 10 years, you've got about a 1.5% difference between the performance of the not-for-profit superannuation funds on the one hand and the for-profit superannuation funds on the other hand, which over time compounds to a significant difference. This slide talks about the performance of self-managed superannuation funds, which are again the third category of superannuation funds in Australia. There's limited data on this segment, and there's a lag in the publication time of it, but we can take a look at its performance over the 5 years to June 2018 and take a look at how that compares to retail and not-for-profit funds. For the self-managed superannuation funds, they are highly tailored and they provide tax advantages. However, their net returns are not as they do not appear to be as strong as the institutional funds. If you look at this performance over 5 years for self-managed funds with 500,000 Australian dollars or less in balance size, they have on average actually delivered negative performance, and for the small self-managed funds, it's actually quite negative, which goes to talk about the benefits of professional trustees and their management and that focus on the members. What's going on in Australia is, and what's driving these performance differences is a number of factors. But this chart shows one of those important ones and it's not just Australia, it's global, about where systems perform well and where they don't perform as well. And it goes to why defaults are really important. Let's talk about the different reasons why you get different performance between funds and products. One of them is asset allocation. Asset allocations to unlisted assets such as infrastructure, property, private equity has generally contributed positive historical outcomes. Governance is another, where trustees that are run on a not-for-profit basis and that are they have a clear purpose to focus on the members is something that delivers strong performance across countries. Where you have directors who represent employees and employers, that adds a healthy oversight component, again, as in Netherlands, Denmark, and the large Canadian defined benefit plans, and even the large American public pension plans such as CalPERS, CalSTRS, New York Common. But there's also the distribution model, and this is where we come back to defaults, which is really important, or the way in which a beneficiary or a member joins a fund. And around the world, there's basically two ways this happens. One way is where people join a fund or a product based on where they work, and they're defaulted into it. And the other is a market approach, where the person chooses their fund or product, often in consultation with a financial planner. Now, most people are not financial experts, and equally, the incentives of financial institutions and planners is really difficult to police, something we see across the world, where there's often a focus on selling products rather than helping people get to the best outcome for them, even if it's just a plain balanced option. And so this slide that we're looking at now shows that in the Australian context, when people have chosen their own fund, the switch, when they make a switch, they'll often choose funds that are operated on a for-profit basis, and they'll often choose funds that have higher fees, which just goes to show that most people are kind of susceptible to that selling risk, and it's something that policymakers need to be really careful about, and why a strong default system can help be a safeguard and a source of protection for consumers. So this is just a little bit about IFM. We're owned by 23 Australian superannuation funds, but we invest on behalf of over 550 institutions around the world, mostly pension funds. And our perspective about pension system policy is one that supports and enables funds with a not-for-profit orientation, who then in turn retain the best quality global advisors from around the world on behalf of their members, with professionally managed products and asset allocation that includes access to unlisted assets, where the beneficiaries join these funds through the workplace, and where the governance includes representation by employers and employees. And we think the evidence is pretty clear globally, as well as in Australia, that that's a pretty good system for most people. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zachary, for your insightful presentation. It's very good to see how heterogeneous our system really is and the returns that are being recorded across the different sectors. So just while we get ready for the next presenter, bring up the presentation, I would now like to introduce Eva Shearling, who's the CEO of the Australian Institute of Superannuation Trustees. Was CEO of the Australian Lawyers Alliance and then moved to the position of Executive Manager, Governance and Stewardship at the Australian Institute of Superannuation Trustees, of which she's now the CEO, as I mentioned. AST advocates for financial well-being in retirement for all Australians, regardless of their gender, culture, education or socio-economic background. Her organisation members are trustee directors, employees of industry, corporate and government superannuation funds. Over to you, Eva. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron, and thank you very much to you and to Teresa for this opportunity to be with you today. So I wanted to just add to Zach's comments initially about what he thinks are some of the common features of successful superannuation or pension systems around the world. I just wanted to add my perspective in relation to why I think the Australian system is so successful. I think it comes down to three different things that were key when the policymakers set up our system the way that it is today. Firstly, it aims at universal coverage. So every Australian worker is intended, every Australian employee is intended to be covered by the system, to try and have full coverage. The second factor is that it's compulsory, that employers must pay the superannuation guarantee on behalf of their employees to help them save for their retirement. So the second factor being compulsion. And then lastly is preservation, that the benefits are preserved and should not be accessed, and only in very limited cases can be accessed before someone reaches retirement age and actually retires. And that is what allows the Australian superannuation funds to have, the luxury, I guess, of having a very long-term view in terms of their investment horizons. Now, what this slide shows is, I guess, where the Australian government state-based pension sits at $422 per week. And the Australian poverty line at the moment is sitting at $433 per week. So as you can see, our state-based pension is merely a safety net and is there to provide for people who are unable to look after themselves, outside of that state-based pension. For most Australians, however, the state-based pension will be supplementary to their superannuation savings. So most Australians will receive in retirement still either a full pension from the state or a part pension. The policy intent is very much to have lower reliance on the pension as the super system continues to mature, but it will always be a very key contributor and an important part of the retirement income system in Australia for millions of Australians. Okay, now I note that these slides don't have the source of the information on them, so I'll try to explain it to you as we go through. This slide comes from the Retirement Income Review, which was a government review that was done of our retirement income system, and the report came out last year in 2020. It shows the average balance for people aged 60 to 64 by their income decile. So if I can explain that, so number one on that horizontal axis is the bottom 10% by income, and 10 is the top 10% by income. So it shows that if you are in the middle taxable incomes, so numbers 5 and 6 on that graph, then the average balance at retirement currently is a bit under $200,000 or just a bit over $200,000 at that age 60 to 64. The average working life taxable income for those in that 5th and 6th decile is between $68,400 a year and $80,200 a year. So they are the average incomes in those fifth and sixth deciles. So someone you know, earning $68,000 a year on average, who goes through this, who is now at age 60 to 64, has $200,000 in their superannuation fund for retirement. So a little bit can actually go a long way. The average income has delivered a balance of between, as I said, you know, sort of around that $200,000 at retirement. A small percentage of their income in super has led to a pretty decent balance. But it's important to bear in mind that these retirees have not had the 10% superannuation guarantee contribution that is currently applicable for their entire working careers. Compulsory superannuation in Australia has only been around for 29 years. So if you think about someone aged 64, they have been working for longer than 29 years. And when they first started their contributions to their retirement savings in superannuation, they started out at a contribution rate of only 3%, not 10%. So our system still has some maturing to do. So Australia's default defined contribution models is the way the default system is designed is really as a wholesale, low-cost type structure. The investment is on behalf of a large collective of people for the longer term. That is one of its you know, key factors of success. Currently, funds are listed in industrial awards, and if you don't choose your own fund, you are then put into a fund that has been negotiated with between the industrial parties as being appropriate for people working in that business. So funds are tailored to demographics as well. Blue collar, white collar, male, female, you know, what is the proportion of people working in that industry that are old or young, those sorts of things come into play. The recent changes that have been introduced in Australia around the default model, which I'll explain a little bit at the end of my presentation, does restrict those new people entering an employer's default fund automatically to only those who are starting their first job. Everyone else in the system currently has been defaulted unless they make their own choice. You can, of course, choose a default fund as opposed to another fund, but as Zach so nicely pointed out in his presentation earlier, the tendency seems to be that when people are making their own choices, they are usually sold into products and not always making the best decisions for their retirement future. So in terms of union bargaining that was occurring in the 1980s and since then, there's been this legislated universal entitlement for all working people since 1992, as I said. Before that, only about 1/3 of the Australian workforce had superannuation entitlements. They were primarily men and primarily government employees. So this change to our retirement income system that was introduced in 1992 has created much greater equity across the Australian working population. Currently, the superannuation guarantee contribution is set at 10% paid by employers. And there is a legislated timetable to increase that to 12% by 2025. Tax concessions in our system are very heavily weighted to higher income earners. So generally speaking, contributions to superannuation are taxed at 15%. Then there is an earnings tax as well. So the interest on the earnings is also taxed at 15%, but there is no tax on withdrawal once you are retired and accessing your retirement income. The Australian superannuation system is set up as a trust system, as you already know from Zach. The money is held on behalf of all beneficiaries and managed for the long term to benefit the beneficiaries. So the trustees are responsible for making sure that they are investing that money for people's retirement incomes and managing the best financial interests of their members. There are very strict protections in place and a lot of protections in our system to ensure that people, superannuants, can have confidence in the system and that superannuation trustees are acting in their best interests when making decisions around how to invest that retirement savings pool. So just something to explain, I guess, my super accounts. So a number of years ago, the Australian government decided that it would be to simplify Australian superannuation and for people who are defaulted into a superannuation fund, that they can only be defaulted into My Super products. So the three key features of a My Super product are that the fees are capped, that the features of the product are incredibly simple. There's no bells and whistles. Strictly looking at retirement income, and there are only two ways of for the investment options to work: either a single diversified option or a life cycle investment option. And I think Nick is going to talk to you a little bit more about the difference between those two in his presentation, so I won't go into that. Around 1/3 of all superannuation assets in the Australian system are currently sitting in My Super products, and they are the best performing parts of the sector. So this is a little bit more about the tax treatment of retirement income in our system here in Australia. The slide outlines how the government support is distributed in the retirement income system. This graph comes also from the 2020 Retirement Income Review report that the Australian government ran last year. So as you can see, even at the 90th percentile there is still a small line of purple. I'm not sure if you can see that clearly, but even at the 90th income percentile, some people are still receiving a part pension in the Australian system at the moment. So the government age pension and the superannuation system are really intended to work in tandem. And for low income earners, you can see their age pension is topped up by some superannuation savings, but the majority of the benefit that they're getting from the government, be that through tax concessions or the pension, is coming from the age pension for those lower income. This is a graph that's taken from the Productivity Commission review of the superannuation system, which reported in Australia in 2018, so it's a couple of years old now. This graph shows investment performance over a 12-year period, so slightly different long-term horizon than what Zach's slides showed you. And as you can see here, circled in the red, you have returns of 5.12% in the retail sector and 7.10% in the not-for-profit sector. So why is there this 2% gap? Most of the difference was put down by the Productivity Commission, who handled this review, to asset allocation. In fact, 1.4% of that 2% differential was put down to asset allocation. So how is it that not-for-profit funds invest differently to the retail funds, and why is it that they outperform in most asset classes? Well, firstly, it's because of the distribution model and the default flows of monies into the not-for-profit funds. And that allows them to take very much a long-term approach to investing, so they can build and reinvest in the assets. So, for example, there is a train station here in Melbourne, the Southern Cross station. The not-for-profit funds were able to build that station and then continue to reap the rewards from their ongoing investment in it. There's also a much higher allocation to unlisted infrastructure in these not-for-profit and My Super funds, and because of their tendency to work collectively and set up collective vehicles, IFM being one of them, there's also a lot more innovation and collaboration to find these savings, and therefore be able to pass on those additional profits to members in their retirement income. The rest of the difference is probably in fees. So what about the fee difference? Well, the fact that the trustees are run not-for-profit means that all profits are returned to the members, and there aren't shareholders who can clip the ticket along the way. Funds can keep costs low because they have a good tendency and a good history of in-housing and using collective vehicles that they've set up as well. This too is from the Productivity Commission report back in 2018. It just highlights what I was saying before, that the majority of high-performing funds are actually MySuper funds, as opposed to those where people are making a choice outside of those default products. So this is the most recent change that has been made in the Australian system in terms of how default will work for new employees. And the term that the government has used to describe this is called stapling, where new employees will be stapled to their first fund, essentially. So that is just a little bit of a flow chart to show if you're a new employee, you can still choose a fund, but if you don't and you have an existing fund, you will then be stapled to that fund as you change jobs. Our Australian Taxation Office is involved in this process because they are the ones that hold the data in relation to where people's superannuation accounts are. But I just thought that was maybe interesting to highlight that for you. And I'll leave it there to make sure that you've got plenty of time with Nick Sherry.
Thank you very much for your presentation. There was many takeaways in there, particularly for me, the way that our system is set up to protect its members. And I'm glad you raised stapling, because that has not been something that we've talked to COFIA extensively about, but for increasingly transient or mobile workforce, stapling is a fundamental principle that is protected, should protect younger workers in particular. I wish I had it when I was younger.